Welcome! In this series of videos, we will cover the design and implementation of a project, from initial design through coding and development to testing, using the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will continue our project to look at the use of software auto forms by fixing a bug and adding validation. We haven't released a video on the auto forms project for nearly a year. But I have discovered there's one bug and one extra bit of functionality we can fit into this project. But first, I'll give an overview of the project, as it has been some time since you've seen one of these videos. The idea behind the project was to create two executables. The first executable is called Form Runner. When Form Runner is executed, it will display a list of forms from which the user can pick. When the user selects a form and then clicks the Run Form button, another executable will run. This will read data in a config file to display information on screen. This auto form application is quite generic. All the information to position the controls on the dialog comes from the config file. Therefore, you can create new forms without having to recompile the PowerBasic code. Within this application, you can view a list of forms that have already been keyed in for this particular form type. And you can add in a new form just by typing in and navigate through the form list using the navigation buttons at the top right-hand corner of the screen. The bug which we're going to be looking at today is to do with our last addition of a daily hours column. This is configured to be dependent on this home working tick box being ticked. The tick box beside working at home, once ticked, will display an enter hours per day text box. When that is entered and we complete the rest of the form and then hit the OK button, it will be saved into a CSV file which we can view by clicking on the toolbar. And there we can see our latest addition, Tim Smith, now has an entry for home working for 2 daily hours. However, if we navigate back to that form, we will see it's not displaying the conditional box on screen. This is the bug. The data is there in the CSV file, but not being displayed on the form. Before we get into the code, let's have a look inside the Forms folder. Inside the Forms folder, we have autoform.exe and its source code. This is the application, which is generic, and it reads data within the configs folder. Within the configs folder, we have a number of CSV files and text files. If we look at test demo 4, we will see this gives us a list of all the objects which will appear on this form, the text which they are to have, the location on the screen to which they're going to appear, the width and height, and a unique ID number for each of these dialog controls. And there are additional columns to allow us to set things like tooltips, defaults, conditional settings. In other words, this one here, the court will only appear if 2005, the leave type, is selected for a particular value, in this case, jury duty. This allows you quite a lot of flexibility with the design of forms. So of the two changes we're going to make today to this auto form application is one to fix the bug, so that when we navigate to the form which has been ticked for home working, we get the conditional object appearing with the data contained within it. Additionally, I'm going to add an extra column to this config file to allow us to set validation. In the Enter Hours Per Day text box, the user can key in either a number or a letter from the keyboard. As daily hours is always going to be a number, we want to restrict the user so that it can only key in numbers. Now, in theory, we can already do that by putting into the function box to say number only. However, this uses the Windows restriction on a text box, and although it will allow any number between 0 and 9, it will not allow a decimal point. So if you need to take in 1.5, as in 1.5 hours, it will not allow you to key the period, the decimal point. Plus, there are other things we may want to put in other boxes. For example, the user has to key a number larger than 5 or less than 10. So this new validation column is going to give us that flexibility. So now that we've covered the basic functionality of this form system, let's go and have a look at the code. And here we are in the folder containing our source code. If we go into the Forms folder, the first thing we're going to change is in the Configs folder. In the Configs folder, we have our CSV files. These are the CSV files that drive our application. If we have a look at the test demo 4 CSV file, we will see these are each of the objects which are going to appear on our form. And we're specifically interested in this hours per day. At the moment, in the conditional column, we have the hours per day, both label and text, containing the values 2013. This is the conditional control which has to be turned on in order for these two fields to appear. So as you will see, 2013 is a tick box. The tick box will default to 0, which means not ticked. In our selection column, we have the value 1, which means that if the tick box, which is defined by 2013, has a value 1 within it, in other words, it is ticked, then we want these two boxes to appear. And the opposite is also true. If the value within that tick box is 0, then we want these two controls on screen to be invisible to the user. So we'll need to look to see how we can handle this within the code. So we will come back to this config file in a moment, but let's nip back to our code. When the form is displayed on screen, we call a specific function to populate that form with data. And that function is fill form with record. If we have a look at that function, we can see all the code which will populate our form. And further down that code are the specific pieces of code which handle the setting of the data within the control. So each of the types of objects is actually handled separately. For example, setting a text box uses the control setText command. But for a drop-down list, we're using a function called selectCombo. And for listbox, select listbox, and so on. And this is done within a for next loop. What we don't have within this current function is a way of determining whether the control should be visible or not visible. So we're going to have to create a new function. This new function will determine whether the control we're currently populating has actually got a parent or not. In the case of the tick box, it would be the parent to our child control. And the visibility of our child control would be conditional on the value held within the parent. So we're going to call this new function hasParentControl, and we're going to be passing some information to that function to allow it to do the job. We'll be passing first of all the handle of the dialog we're currently on, the configuration role we're currently processing, and the data held within that role. We have a very similar function elsewhere in the code which already exists, which is hasDependentControl. What we're going to be doing is something very similar to this function. The hasDependentControl operates the opposite way around. It looks for controls which have related child controls. So here is the skeleton of our brand new function taking its 3 parameters. This will look for other controls that have this current control as a child control. And we're creating a number of local variables to allow us to process that information. First of all, we have to get from our config array the reference of the parent control, the one we're currently processing. As you may remember from the previous videos, all our config information is held in a global array called strconfig. And we've already passed in the config row number, which is the row within that array. So we're parsing out from this array the ref ID column. This is the unique reference of this object. And we're populating the ref ID variable. So since we're picking up 2013, we'll be searching through the rest of this array to find the entry for 2013, which is this tick box here. Before we go any further, we're going to add 2 more columns to this config file. We're going to add a label control column and a validation column. So we can now see we've added the 2 extra columns to our config file, a label control column and a validation column. The label control column is the one we're interested in initially. We have 2 objects which we need to control the visibility of. The label that says hours per day and the text box which allows the user to enter the number of daily hours. We could easily work out the fact this text box is dependent on this tick box. However, we're going to make it easy for ourselves to link both this label and this text box together by using the label control column. So in the label control column of the text box, we're putting in the control number of the label. That way, once we've decided that the text box is to be visible or invisible, we can perform exactly the same function on the associated label control by just reading the value in this column. We'll come back later to what we're going to be doing with validation of text boxes, but that's what this validation column is going to be used for. So let's go back to the code. So our first task was to get this value here, the value in the ref ID column, based on the entry coming from the config row. Next, we will populate our payment variable by using the same approach. Next, we want to pick up the value we've just put into this label control column. So we're now picking up the value of any associated label control, in this case 2014. Next, we want to pick up the value in this selection column. This is a value that we're going to be looking for. This will be the trigger for making our control visible or hidden. And we'll populate that in our trigger variable. And if the parent value is 0, then we can exit the function. So now that we have these details, for example, the conditional reference of our parent, we need to find the parent in the config file. So we're going to use a for next loop to search this out. It will sweep through the array and look for 2013 in the ID column. So we'll go from 1 to the upper bounding of our config array, and we'll be pulling out the ref ID and the reference object, which will be us looking for 2013, and then when we find 2013, we're looking at the object column. What kind of object is this? And we're testing that object type to see is it a tick box or is it something else. As we are primarily interested in tick boxes for the moment, we'll handle the tick box first. So the first job is to get the check value of that object to our value variable. So we'll be getting either a 0 or a 1. A 0 if the tick box is not ticked, and a 1 if it is. And having picked up the value, we're then populating that into a string variable, as we're going to be comparing the value in that variable with what we're looking for in the trigger. If the trigger matches the current selection, in other words, trigger would have the value 1 as a string, and selection would either have the value 0 or 1. If it's 1, it means our trigger has matched. And in that case, we'll want to make the control visible to the user. So we can use the control normalize command. and this is where we will pick up the label control. If the label control is greater than 0, then we want to show any associated label control. So 2014, which is this one here, the one that says enter hours per day, if our tick box is visible, we want this label control to be also visible. So we can do a quick if statement to test if the label control is greater than 0, and then we can use the normalize command to make that label control visible to the user. If that's not the case, if the trigger does not match the selection, then we want to hide this control, and if there's a label control, we will hide it as well. And once we have found our parent, we can exit the for loop. What we're also going to have to do at the beginning of our application is to create a couple of new constants. These constants are defined in an enumeration, where we're setting up each of the columns within our config file. So we need a new constant for label control and also one for the validation column. So there are our two new constants, label control and validation. If we do a test compile on the application now, it should compile quite cleanly. So have we done enough to control the objects on screen? Let's try running the application. If we go back to the form runner, and if we pick the test demo number 4 and run the form. On form number 4, if we go back to number 3, we will see that form number 3 is populated. We have ticked to say home working, and we've entered a number of days. If we go back to form number 2, we'll see it is also ticked. So if we untick this, it should make this disappear. So the text box for the number of hours is no longer visible. If we tick it once more, it comes up, but it's blank. So if we untick it, hit the OK button to save that, and have a look at all of the forms for this particular type of form. So we will see that form number 3 has an entry with home working for 2 daily hours, but form number 2 does not. So if we go back to form number 2, go to the beginning where form number 1 is, go to number 2, and it's not visible. But if we click to go to number 3, it pops up to show it's already ticked, and it's showing number 2, and both the text of the label and the control are showing as visible. So in this, we have now fixed the bug we had with the visibility of a conditional text box and associated label control. So now that we have that out of the way, let's look at entering in validation. If we attempt to press a letter key on the keyboard, it comes up unacceptable character. It comes up that way because in the function column for this particular text box, we have the value number only. This makes use of the Windows text control style to allow only numbers between 0 and 9 to be entered in a text box. Any other letter would give you that error message. So if we press 1.5, as soon as we press the decimal point, it comes up unacceptable character. Now, for the purposes of our validation, it's quite possible we may want to put decimal points in. For example, 1.5 hours, 4.5 hours, or 4 3/4 hours. So the purpose of our validation change is to allow us to do more numerical checks on the value that's going in there, to allow numbers which contain decimal points. But we need to go further than this. We want the user to key a value in, but not a value that is ridiculously large. For example, hours per day should be limited to a number smaller than 24. So the hours per day should be a small number. Obviously, it can't be more than 24. But as far as a working day is concerned, perhaps it should be less than 8 or 9 hours. So how can we change the code to put validation on these and display some kind of error message to the user? First thing we'll want to do is to take out this value in the function column so that it no longer triggers. Once that is saved, it would allow any value to be put in. If we run the application now and go into our form, we'll go back to our form 3, and in this box now, we can put any character at all. While it would allow us to save this, as you can see the daily hours is now text, that's not what we want the user to do, so we need to turn on some validation. Validation is quite a big topic. You may want to actually check validation on each of the fields, for example to make sure that the name and payroll number have actually been entered correctly. In here we have Smith in the payroll number field. And you'd expect some other value to sit in there, so we'll want to put validation on all the fields. But we will start with this field here. However, as we've determined that full validation of all our fields is going to be quite complicated and extensive, we're going to leave that to the next video. So in summary, what we've achieved today is we now have control over the visibility of conditional objects on our form. By setting our config file up appropriately, we can have objects which are conditionally displayed depending on the value on a particular object. What we've demonstrated today is the tick box. If the box is ticked, then other controls can be displayed, and we have an implicit link between an object and its label control. What we will do in the next video is we will move on to the validation stage to allow us to validate each type of object on our form. However, that's it for today. Thank you for watching.